What if the poorest night of your life, humiliation, hunger, a date that never came, was the night someone finally saw you clearly? If this story touches your heart, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us bring more healing, hopeful stories to life. Amara Johnson pressed her palms over the faded cotton of her mother's dress, smoothing the wrinkles as if she could iron courage into the seams. The dress was a garden washed pale by time. Petals that once flashed bright now softened into quiet memory. It did not belong in a Manhattan restaurant, not among the dim chandeliers and martini laughter and the scent of butter curling from plates. But it was what she had. And tonight, she meant to belong anyway. Harlem had raised her like a stubborn tree through concrete, teaching her to stand where she was planted. She had learned the rhythm of buses and corner calls, the grit of early shifts and late classes, the small mercies of neighbors with extra soup. On 135th Street, laughter used to roll from their kitchen like warm bread until illness pressed it thin. Since then, the dress, kept for Sundays, hung like a promise. Dignity is not owned. It is carried. A yellow cab eased to the curb on East 52nd. She stepped out into a chill that nipped her wrists, collected her breath, and walked toward a restaurant with tall windows and accurate lighting, the sort of place that made everyone look a little more expensive. She had a reservation, a name, a blind date arranged by Simone, who had said, "Enough with textbooks and scrubs. You deserve to be seen, Amara." The host led her to a small table by the glass. Outside, the city performed itself. Couples with linked arms, a cyclist gliding past, a taxi like a flicker of gold. Inside, the hum of knives and talk and polished shoes. Amara folded into the chair and placed her phone beside the water glass. 7 o'clock came and went. The condensation slid down the glass like slow rain. She checked her reflection in the window, the careful twist of her hair, the mascara that had learned not to run, the dress she had pressed until the iron protested. She rehearsed answers to the questions she hoped he might ask. Why nursing? Why pediatrics? Because small bodies deserve big defenders. Because the ache of a child should never depend on a parent's wallet. Because she remembered the sound her mother made when medical forms grew teeth 710. Her stomach pinched with the boredom of hunger. She told herself not to care. She told herself pride tastes better than panic. She traced the hem of her dress under the table with one finger, the seam a road she could walk with her eyes closed. At 7:15, the phone lit. A new message. She lifted it as if it were a fragile thing. Just kidding. I'm not coming. Didn't think you'd actually show up. LOL. The letters were stones. They struck and sank. The sound in the room didn't change, only her pulse did. She set the phone face down, as if darkness could unwrite the words. Heat climbed her throat. She wished for a bathroom doorway to swallow her, for a hand on her shoulder to steady her. Failing those, she held still. Across the aisle, a man stirred his coffee. He wore a suit that managed to look like a uniform made for him alone, navy, open collar, no tie. He looked like a pause disguised as a person. Ethan Blake, though she did not yet know his name, had come for quiet his office could not afford him. He was used to moving very quickly through rooms that moved for him. But tonight his energy had the tired clarity of someone who has outlived adrenaline. He noticed things when he was like that. He noticed the woman by the window gripping her napkin the way air grips a drowning swimmer. He noticed the way composure costs. He had seen pity before. He carried scars where it had glanced off him like hail. This wasn't pity. This was an ache he recognized, a mirror he did not want to avoid. Amara rose. The chair legs barely whispered against the floor. She folded her napkin and laid it with ordinary care, a ritual to keep chaos polite. She took one step, then two, toward the exit. Her chest tightened, breath the size of a thimble, eyes too dry to cry. She could still make it to the subway. Harlem would take her back without questions. "Miss?" The waiter appeared in her path as if summoned by need. He balanced a plate where the light made the sauce shine, and a tall glass in which lemon slices floated like thin moons. "This is for you." "I didn't order—" Her voice cracked on the second word. "It's already taken care of," he said, with an apology in his smile, tipping his head toward the man across the aisle. She turned. The man did not lift his glass in acclaim, did not lean back like a hero in an ad. He only met her eyes with a steady line of attention, and for 2 seconds the room tilted and righted again. "I don't need charity," she said, finding her balance in the old firm ground of pride. The man's voice arrived like a hand extended palm up, unforced, unthreatening. "It's not charity, it's dinner. Sit. Eat one meal you don't have to fight for." The sentence threaded itself through years of hunger and landed somewhere safe. She didn't know why this stranger's tone loosened the knot behind her ribs. Maybe because he did not add anything sticky. No flirt, no transaction, no implied ledger. Just a plain statement that tasted like permission. She returned to her chair because the choice not to flee felt like a kind of victory. The fork was a small weight. She twirled pasta and brought it to her mouth, the steam brushing her face like a blessing. Tomato and basil and olive oil did what food is supposed to do, reminded a body of its claim to gentleness. The shock was not how good it tasted, but how swiftly her shame lost its teeth. She looked up, and the stranger, Ethan, though unnamed, had already pulled his gaze back to his coffee, giving her cover. Kindness, the kind that understands not to stare, can feel like architecture. It holds a roof over you while you remember yourself. Outside the window, a taxi merged. Inside, laughter rose. A bartender shook ice. The city was a machine that does not wait for grief. Amara's hands steadied. She took another bite, then another, inhabiting the quiet in which humiliation faded into a story she might one day tell herself without flinching. When the plate was half empty, the man stood. He crossed the small gulf between their tables as if crossing a street he'd checked both ways. Up close, she saw that he was not older so much as softened by the kind of weary that comes after storms. He stopped just beyond the boundary where intrusion begins and respect ends. "You don't have to leave," he said, voice low enough to belong to the two of them alone. "It's only dinner." "I didn't ask you to pay," she replied, because fairness is a shelter, and she had learned to live under it. "I know." He nodded once, accepting the truth as if it were weather. "And if you want me to cancel it, I will. I thought perhaps you might let a stranger keep a small promise to a fellow human." "What promise?" "That no one should walk away hungry because someone else forgot how to be kind." Her breath faltered. He didn't blink when she studied him, as if he had no interest in being impressive. Was that what steadiness looked like when it survived ambition? She set the fork down carefully. "Thank you," she said, because gratitude said plainly is a kind of spine. He glanced toward the door, giving her an exit if she wanted one. "Good night." He had already turned back when she said, "Wait, what's your name?" He paused. "Ethan." "Amara," she answered, as if her name could shake hands. Then she let him go, because dignity sometimes means leaving space around kindness so it can breathe. She finished the pasta without hurry. Her phone remained face down, the cruel message trapped under glass where it could not leak into the food. When she stood again, she did not feel small. The dress felt less like a costume, more like a history she could honor. Outside, October made a clean sound in the air. The city would never notice her steps. But somewhere inside the noise, a quiet shift had happened. A stranger's steadiness had interrupted the story she thought the night would write. And though she could not see it yet, a thread had been tied between the window table and a life still forming. A thread made of ordinary mercy, the kind that turns the poorest night into a door. Across the room, Ethan returned to his coffee and the long inventory of what could not be fixed by money. He did not follow her out. He did not even watch her leave. Yet something in him eased, as if, for once, he had chosen a form of power that did not require applause. Amara stepped into the current of the sidewalk, and the city carried her forward. She would sleep in Harlem under a radiator that clanked like a stubborn train. In the morning, she would wake to clinical rotations and lectures and the strong tea of resolve. But tonight, she had eaten with dignity. Tonight, a stranger had looked at her without asking for any part of her in return. And that is a kind of wealth you can store in your bones. Before the subway stairs, she turned back once. Not to the restaurant, but to the idea it had given her. That maybe she belonged not by permission, but by presence. She touched the seam of the dress, felt the old thread, and smiled a small, private smile. Somewhere in the city, a man named Ethan would finish his coffee. He would return to a daughter sleeping and a home that had learned the shapes of absence. He would wake tomorrow and do what men do who have made promises to the people they love. And perhaps, when he opened a boardroom door, he would carry with him the memory of a woman in a faded dress who refused to starve her dignity. On the train, the carriage hummed. The night breathed. Amara closed her eyes and felt the warm echo of pasta and a sentence that did not feel like rescue. Eat one meal you don't have to fight for. It was not a vow. It was a beginning. The restaurant's lamps glowed warmer now, like candle flames that refused to notice one girl's humiliation had cracked open and spilled across her evening. Amara sat rigid at the window table, her fork resting in a nest of pasta that still steamed, as if insisting she claim it. The waiter had drifted away, leaving her alone with the plate, the lemonade, and the bewildering knowledge that a stranger's attention had given her something she could not buy. Dignity on a night when her own pride was bleeding. She told herself to stand, to walk away before she felt indebted. Harlem had taught her survival math. Nothing comes free, and kindness usually has a hook. But hunger has a way of softening even the sharpest suspicion. She twirled a bite, lips trembling, then took it in. The flavors, tomato, garlic, basil, spread like warmth into cold rooms inside her chest. She was so intent on steadying her hands that she almost didn't notice when the man rose from his table and crossed the narrow aisle. He stood just outside the circle of her solitude, tall, deliberate, his presence quiet rather than demanding. "I don't mean to intrude," he said, his voice low enough that only she heard. "But if you leave now, you'll never taste the rest." Amara bristled. "You think I need your permission to eat?" He shook his head. "Not permission. Just a reminder. It's one meal. You deserve at least that much." Her jaw tightened. "I don't want anyone's pity." "Neither do I," he replied evenly. Something flickered in his gaze, an honesty that startled her. "And I promise you, that's not what this is." For a moment, silence pressed between them. The laughter from the bar felt distant, like a soundtrack to another life. Finally, Amara sighed, motioning toward the opposite chair. "If you insist on speaking, at least sit down. I don't like people looking down at me." A faint smile touched his lips, respectful, not smug. He sat. The candle between them wavered, throwing soft light over his face. Up close, Amara noticed the lines around his eyes. Marks not of age, but of fatigue. He looked like someone who hadn't rested properly in years. His suit was expensive, though worn casually, his shirt collar open as if he had abandoned formality halfway through the day. I'm Amara, she said, her tone cautious. Ethan, he replied. He didn't extend a hand, only nodded as though her name deserved a bow. The waiter returned with quiet efficiency, setting down another glass of water. Ethan lifted it, his voice calm. To dignity, he said simply, before taking a sip. Amara hesitated, then mirrored him. To survival, she whispered, clinking her glass against his. They ate. At first, only the sound of forks and the hum of conversation filled the space. But gradually, words trickled out, like cautious steps over ice. You don't strike me as someone who usually lets strangers buy dinner, Ethan said. I don't, Amara replied. She set her fork down and met his gaze, steady as she could manage. But I was tired of choosing between pride and hunger. His eyes softened. That's not a choice anyone should have to make. You say that like you've never been forced to. A shadow moved across his face, but he didn't look away. I know what it means to sit at a table and feel like no one sees you. Sometimes money doesn't change that. The simplicity of it disarmed her. She didn't push. Instead, she asked, Why here? Why tonight? He exhaled, a small sigh that carried more weight than words. Because I was tired, too, of boardrooms, of noise that doesn't matter. I wanted quiet, and then... He tilted his head slightly, studying her without intrusion. I saw you trying not to break. Amara flushed, a mix of shame and something dangerously close to gratitude. You shouldn't watch people like that. Maybe not, he admitted. But if I hadn't, I wouldn't have been able to do something small. And sometimes small is all we can manage. They fell into silence again, but it was different now. No longer brittle, but tentative, curious. Amara found herself eating more steadily, the fork no longer trembling. Each bite was no longer humiliation swallowed, but nourishment accepted. Halfway through the meal, Ethan leaned back, folding his arms. Tell me something true, Amara. Something about you that isn't obvious. She frowned. That's an odd request. Honest requests usually are. She thought for a moment, then said, I'm in nursing school, pediatrics, and I'm going to finish, no matter how many shifts I have to work or how many nights I fall asleep on the subway. His brow lifted. Why pediatrics? Because children can't fight for themselves. They need someone who sees them, someone who remembers that numbers on charts are people. The words came sharper than she intended, as though rehearsed in her chest for years. Ethan's expression didn't falter. If anything, it deepened. Then you're already braver than most executives I know, he said softly. She blinked, startled. You sound like you've been in too many rooms with people who forget that. Maybe I have. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask. Instead, she studied him anew. This wasn't just a man with a credit card and good manners. There was an exhaustion to him, yes, but also a watchfulness. He saw, and that unnerved her more than anything. The plates emptied. The waiter cleared them. Amara leaned back, folding her hands in her lap. For the first time that day, her stomach wasn't hollow. Thank you, she said finally, her voice steady. For the food, for not making it worse. Ethan nodded. No thanks needed. Just keep your strength. You'll need it. For what? For whatever comes next, he said, as if he knew something about life's cruelty that she hadn't yet seen. She rose first. He didn't try to stop her, didn't ask for her number, didn't step into her path. He only inclined his head, his eyes steady as if to say, You walk your road, and I'll respect it. As she left, Amara realized the strangest thing. She no longer felt abandoned. She had come for a date who mocked her. She was leaving with no promises, no romance, and no expectation. Yet somehow she was walking out with something rarer. She had been seen. And in that restaurant, for the first time in weeks, she had eaten without shame. The week after, the restaurant felt stretched thin for Amara, like gauze pulled over too many wounds. She buried herself in clinical rotations at Columbia University Medical Campus, where the scent of antiseptic clung to the air and the steady beep of monitors became the rhythm of her days. Her life was measured in vitals, charting, and the small voices of children who clung to stuffed animals during exams. She tried not to think about Ethan, the stranger who had rescued her dignity without demanding anything in return. But his words clung to her ribs. Eat one meal you don't have to fight for. Sometimes she heard them on the subway when her stomach pinched with hunger, sometimes in the quiet of her Harlem room when she was too tired to cook. It wasn't romance, she remembered, but the steadiness in his voice. A steadiness she hadn't known she craved. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, her umbrella flipped inside out on the corner of 168th Street. She ducked into the nearest coffee shop, shaking raindrops from her sleeves. The place buzzed with medical students hunched over laptops, nurses in scrubs laughing into foam cups, and the hiss of the espresso machine competing with the chatter. She ordered the cheapest item, a small black coffee, and scanned the room for a seat. Every table was crowded except one in the back, where papers sprawled across the wood like a storm. A laptop glowed amid the mess, and behind it sat a man she recognized instantly. Ethan. Her breath caught. He was dressed more casually than before, his jacket draped over the back of the chair, sleeves rolled, tie absent. His brow furrowed as he scanned spreadsheets and notes, lips pressed into a line of frustration. He looked less like a powerful CEO and more like an exhausted student cramming for finals. Her instinct screamed retreat. She could vanish into the rain before he noticed. Their paths had crossed once. There was no need for another collision. But as if pulled by a tether, Ethan lifted his head. His eyes found hers across the crowded cafe. Recognition sparked, followed not by surprise but by something gentler, as though he had been waiting. He raised a hand, understated, an invitation without pressure. Amara hesitated, then moved toward him, weaving between chairs. When she reached the table, he pushed a stack of papers aside, clearing space as though her presence mattered more than his work. Amara, he said, her name spoken like a memory he had carried. You remember? She asked, startled. I remember courage, he replied. Names come after that. Her cheeks warmed. She set down her coffee and slid into the seat across from him. The table between them felt smaller than it should have. What are you doing here? She asked. This doesn't look like a corner office. Ethan gave a rueful smile, tapping the papers. Trying to solve a problem. We launched a new line of toddler snacks last quarter. Organic, preservative-free. On paper, it should have been perfect. But sales tanked. Parents complain, kids spit them out. The board wants answers, and I can't find them in the numbers. Amara arched a brow. So the CEO of Blake Organics is hiding in a coffee shop, trying to understand why children won't eat his snacks? Something like that, he admitted. She sipped her coffee, studying him. Maybe the problem isn't in the charts. Parents don't care about percentages or compliance. They care about what happens at the kitchen table, whether their child actually swallows a bite or spits it onto the floor. He leaned forward, intrigued. And you know this because I spend 12 hours a day with parents who tell me exactly that. Kids are brutally honest critics. If food doesn't comfort them, no marketing campaign will fix it. Her words landed like stones in still water. Ethan sat back, eyes narrowing in thought. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. The sound was deep, genuine, unguarded. You just summarized 3 months of board meetings, he said, shaking his head. And you did it in under a minute. Amara blinked. I wasn't trying to impress you. That's what makes it impressive. The corner of her mouth curved, despite herself. She hadn't smiled all week, but somehow, with him, it slipped out like sunlight between clouds. You don't look like a man who listens, she said quietly. Ethan tilted his head. Maybe I haven't had the right person to listen to. The words carried weight, heavier than flirtation, steadier than charm. Amara looked away, focusing on the swirl of steam above her cup. Yet her heart thudded louder, betraying her calm. Around them, the cafe buzzed with noise, students muttering mnemonics, baristas shouting orders, rain tapping against the windows. But at their small table, the world slowed. Amara broke the silence. You should bring parents into your process. Real parents. Pay them to tell you what works, and stop pretending that health has to taste boring. Ethan chuckled. Noted. You may have just saved me a few $1,000,000. She raised an eyebrow. I'm not billing you for free advice. Then I'll call it an investment, he replied, his gaze steady. Her laugh escaped before she could stop it, light and unguarded. She shook her head, gathering her bag. I should go. Patients don't chart themselves. Ethan gathered his papers, though his eyes lingered. Amara, he said, her name deliberate. Thank you for speaking plainly. She hesitated, then nodded. Good luck with your snacks, Ethan. And just like that, she was gone, swept back into the current of the city. Ethan sat for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from him. The spreadsheets still cluttered the table, the numbers still refused to solve themselves. But in the chaos, one truth had crystallized. The only words that made sense all week were the ones spoken by a nursing student in a faded dress who refused to shrink. The invitation had arrived like a miracle disguised in plain stationery. Amara found it tucked into her campus mailbox at Columbia, a cream-colored envelope embossed with the seal of NYU Langone Health. Inside, a formal letter announced she had been awarded a sponsored seat at the Pediatric Nutrition Conference, registration fees, textbooks, and workshops all covered. Her first thought was disbelief. She had never applied. Students in her program didn't get picked for events like this. Her second thought, sharper, was suspicion. Who would spend hundreds of dollars to make sure a Harlem nursing student could sit among the city's brightest medical minds? She didn't need long to guess. That night, she found Ethan's name attached to the sponsorship list, quiet, unpublicized, tucked behind the corporate banner of Blake Organics. He hadn't mentioned it during their coffee shop encounter. He hadn't even hinted. He had simply made space for her to step into a room she never would have entered alone. Her pride wrestled with her gratitude. Pride said she didn't want his help. Gratitude whispered that perhaps this was not about him, but about the children she longed to serve. In the end, gratitude won. The morning of the conference dawned crisp. The sky stretched bright above Manhattan's skyline. Amara wore her cleanest scrubs beneath a borrowed blazer, her mother's pearl earrings tucked like secrets beneath her hair. The lobby of NYU Langone buzzed with white coats and tailored suits, voices sharp with confidence. She felt like a trespasser walking into a cathedral of intellect. Yet when she pinned her name badge, Amara Johnson, Columbia nursing student, a current of determination steadied her. She belonged, if not by status, then by purpose. The keynote hall brimmed with rows of seats, screens flashing slides about childhood obesity rates, allergies on the rise, and the chemical footprint of processed foods. Doctors with Ivy League pedigrees spoke in polished tones, layering statistics on statistics. Amara listened intently, scribbling notes, her heart pounding with every chart that reminded her of children she had seen. tiny hands trembling, parents worrying aloud about rashes and coughs, families counting pennies before filling prescriptions. When the floor opened for questions, she hesitated. Her voice, she thought, would sound out of place among scholars. But then she remembered Ethan's words at the coffee shop. Parents don't care about percentages. They care about whether their child actually swallows a bite. She rose. "Excuse me," she began, her voice carrying farther than she expected. Heads turned, professors glanced, the microphone passed into her hand. "I want to ask about allergen labeling. Many of my pediatric patients come from low-income families who don't always have access to the newest organic brands. They rely on supermarket shelves, where preservative-free is written in bold, but allergen disclosures are buried in fine print. How are we ensuring that a mother who speaks English as a second language, or a father juggling 2 jobs, can actually understand what's safe for their child?" The room shifted. Silence fell heavier than applause. One panelist cleared his throat. "That's a significant point, but federal guidelines—" "With respect, sir," Amara interrupted, surprising even herself. "Guidelines don't prevent emergency room visits. Clear communication does. If we want to lower rates of anaphylaxis, we can't just target the affluent. We have to protect every child, especially the ones most at risk." A murmur rippled through the audience, some nodding, some whispering. The moderator smiled tightly, moving to the next hand raised. But the question lingered, suspended in the air like smoke. Amara sat down, her pulse racing. She thought she had embarrassed herself. She stared at her notepad, unable to meet anyone's eyes. At the back of the hall, Ethan stood quietly, his arms folded, watching her with something close to awe. He had come not as a keynote speaker, nor as a CEO hunting partnerships, but simply as a man who wanted to see what she would do when given a platform. And she had not only stood tall, she had shifted the weight of the room. During the break, Amara stepped into the crowded foyer lined with posters and exhibitors. She pressed a paper cup of coffee to her lips, hoping the bitterness would drown her nerves. "You spoke well." She turned. A pediatrician with silver hair and kind eyes stood beside her. His badge read, "Dr. Andrew Klein, Johns Hopkins." "Do you really think so?" she asked, startled. "I've attended these conferences for 20 years, he said. "It's rare someone asks the right question, not just the clever one. Keep doing that. The system needs voices like yours." Her chest tightened. Gratitude and disbelief swirled until her eyes stung. "Thank you, Doctor. Truly." He nodded once, then melted into the crowd, leaving her steadier than before. Across the foyer, Ethan watched her again, this time from a respectful distance. He didn't approach. He didn't want to steal her moment. But a thought echoed in his mind. She is not only surviving, she is a force waiting to be seen. By the end of the day, Amara's notebook brimmed with ideas, new studies on plant-based proteins, innovative approaches to allergy management, the social determinants of diet. She clutched it like a treasure chest. On the subway home, she leaned her head against the window and allowed herself to imagine a future where her voice carried weight. Not because Ethan had paid her way into a room, but because once inside, she had dared to speak. Somewhere in the city, Ethan returned to his office, facing a board skeptical of his leadership after the failed product launch. But in his mind, one voice overrode the noise, the nursing student who had reminded a room of experts that children are more than statistics. The Bronx Library had always been Amara's refuge. Its tall windows let in shafts of dusty sunlight, and its shelves whispered the language of survival, free access to worlds she could never afford. Between rotations, she often ducked inside, clutching textbooks she could not buy, piecing together knowledge with the discipline of someone who knew what hunger of the mind felt like. That Saturday, the air outside carried the bite of November, the streets bright with vendors selling roasted peanuts and scarves. Amara entered the library expecting silence, only to hear the gentle giggles of a child from the children's section. She froze when she recognized the voice that answered the laughter. Ethan's. He stood by a low shelf, one hand braced against a stack of picture books, the other resting protectively on the small shoulders of a girl. The child's curls glowed in the light, her cheeks round with the softness of early childhood. She clutched a picture book against her chest as though it were treasure. Amara's heart lurched. She hadn't known Ethan was a father. The little girl spotted her first. Wide eyes met Amara's, curious, unguarded. Then she padded over with small, certain steps, clutching the book. "You smell like flowers," the child said solemnly. Then, in a whisper, she added, "Like Mommy used to." The words cracked the air open. Ethan's head snapped up, his face suddenly drained of color. The weight of memory descended over him, so heavy Amara could almost feel it pressing against her own chest. He opened his mouth as if to correct his daughter, then closed it, caught between grief and silence. Amara bent down, lowering herself to the child's eye level. "Hi there," she said softly. "What's your name?" "Lily," the girl answered. She pressed the book forward as though offering proof of existence. "Daddy's helping me find stories. Mommy used to read them, but she's in heaven now." Ethan's hand closed briefly over his daughter's shoulder, steadying himself more than her. His throat worked, but no words came. Amara's instinct screamed to retreat. This was too intimate, too raw. But Lily's innocence held her in place. She smiled gently. "That's a beautiful name, Lily. And you know what? Books are like little hugs from the people we miss. When you open one, sometimes it feels like they're still here." Lily studied her with solemn curiosity, then broke into a grin. "Will you read to me?" Ethan's eyes widened. "Lily!" His voice broke on her name, but Amara, reading the storm on his face, answered carefully, "I'd love to if Daddy doesn't mind." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. He seemed caught between resistance and surrender, grief and gratitude. Finally, he nodded, his voice low. "Just one story." They sat together on a bright rug patterned with letters. Lily curled against Amara's side, small and trusting, as Amara opened the book. Her voice softened into rhythm, carrying the simple tale of a rabbit who searched the world for its missing family. The child's giggles rose at the silly parts. Her breathing slowed at the tender ones. Ethan sat across from them, his eyes fixed not on the pages but on Amara's face. She read as if she had done it 100 times. Her tone shifted with each character, her laughter woven through the words. For Lily, it was entertainment. For Ethan, it was unbearable and miraculous all at once. He hadn't heard that melody of comfort since his wife's voice had been silenced. When the story ended, Lily clapped. "Again!" Ethan managed a faint smile. "Another time, sweetheart. Let's not wear Miss Amara out." Amara handed the book back with gentle hands. "You have a smart little girl," she said quietly. "She's everything," Ethan answered, his voice raw. Lily ran back to the shelves, her small fingers trailing along spines of books. In her absence, silence folded in like a heavy curtain. Ethan leaned closer. "I'm sorry," he whispered. She doesn't usually talk about her mother with strangers." Amara met his gaze. She wasn't talking to a stranger. She was talking to someone who listened. The words landed like balm, though they cost her something. To sit in the shadow of a dead wife was to accept a grief that wasn't hers. But she could see in Ethan's eyes that her presence had cracked open a door he had kept locked for too long. When Lily returned with another book, Amara stood. I should go. I don't want to intrude. You weren't intruding, Ethan said, almost too quickly. Then he caught himself, added with restraint, but I understand. She smiled at Lily. Maybe we'll bump into each other again. Lily nodded enthusiastically. Promise? Promise, Amara said, though she knew promises like that were fragile. As she turned toward the exit, Ethan followed a step. Amara, he said softly, stopping her. Thank you for handling that. For handling us. She looked at him, at the weariness around his eyes, at the way his shoulders sagged with years of carrying too much alone. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do, she said gently, is not to fix what hurts, but to sit with it. Then she left, her footsteps echoing across the marble floor, her heart unsteady. Ethan stood where she had left him, watching his daughter hug the book like a lifeline. For the first time in years, he let the tears come. Not many. Just enough to remind him he was still human. And though he didn't know it yet, a seed had been planted that day in the Bronx Library, one that would change not only his life, but Lily's and Amara's as well. The library encounter changed something neither of them could easily name. It was not a declaration, not even a spoken invitation, but a quiet thread drawn tighter between their lives. After that day, Amara began noticing Ethan in places she did not expect. Walking Lily to school near 149th Street, waiting in the hospital lobby during Amara's shifts, or slipping into the same cafe where she studied after hours. At first, she thought it coincidence. Then she realized it was rhythm. Their days had begun to overlap, not by arrangement, but by gravity. It started small. Ethan emailed her a document, an early draft of a research proposal on pediatric nutrition for Blake Organics. The subject line read simply, "Would you glance at this?" Amara frowned at the attachment. She was a nursing student, not a consultant, but curiosity won. She opened the file, scanned the jargon, and laughed softly at how badly it missed the point. It was all market angles and shelf appeal, with no thought of what children or parents actually lived. She typed back, "You can't put easy to digest on the label if the ingredient list reads like a chemistry exam." To her surprise, Ethan replied within minutes. "So you're saying honesty sells?" "No," she wrote, biting back a smile. "I'm saying health matters more than profit, and if you ignore that, families will see right through you." That night began what turned into a pattern. Long email exchanges that stretched past midnight, trading drafts, questions, challenges. Ethan began to rely on her plain-spoken clarity. Amara, in turn, found herself confessing more than she meant. Her dreams of opening community clinics, her fear of failing board exams, her exhaustion balancing shifts and study. Some evenings, Ethan brought Lily along when they met at the library or a cafe. Amara would crouch to tie Lily's shoelaces or gently explain a homework problem. Other nights, Ethan came alone, papers spread across the table, his forehead creased until Amara's laughter cracked the silence. They never called them dates. There were no flowers, no hand-holding, no confessions whispered across candlelight. Yet the hours they shared took on the weight of intimacy. Laughter over spilled coffee, silence as they both typed into laptops, the quiet comfort of knowing someone else was awake at the same strange hour. One night in late November, Amara sat by her window in Harlem, typing corrections into one of Ethan's drafts. Outside, the street buzzed with the usual mix of horns and voices, a city that never granted rest. Her phone buzzed with a new message. "Are you awake?" She laughed softly. "Obviously. You wouldn't send me this many misplaced commas otherwise." His reply came quickly. "Do you ever stop?" "No. Survival doesn't pause," she wrote back. Then, before she could stop herself, she added, "Do you?" There was a long pause. Then, "I tried. When my wife died, I stopped everything. But Lily didn't let me stay, stopped." Her fingers hovered over the screen, her heart heavy. "I'm sorry, Ethan. Truly." His answer, "You don't need to be sorry. Just don't vanish." She swallowed hard, staring at those words. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even a request. It was a truth, laid bare in the space between them. Another night, Ethan walked her home after a long study session. The air smelled of roasted chestnuts from a street vendor. The city lights shimmered against wet pavement. They spoke little, their footsteps echoing together. At her building door, Amara turned. "Why are you doing this?" He looked puzzled. "Doing what?" "All of it. The sponsorship, the papers, these walks. You don't need me." Ethan's expression softened, shadows deep around his eyes. Need and want aren't the same. "I don't need your help, Amara. I want your voice in the room. It makes me see clearly and—" He stopped as if catching himself. "It makes me feel less alone." Her breath caught. For a heartbeat, she thought he might reach for her hand. But he didn't. He only nodded once, then stepped back. "Good night, Amara." She climbed the stairs with her heart pounding, both relieved and disappointed that he hadn't crossed that line. The nameless evenings accumulated like beads on a string, each one small, but together forming something undeniable. Amara found herself waiting for his emails, listening for Lily's giggle in library aisles, watching the clock with a secret hope it would line up with his. And Ethan, though he never said it, felt the same. He would sit at his desk drafting sterile memos, only to delete them halfway through because he wanted instead to tell Amara the truth, that her voice had become the steady background to his days, the anchor against the endless tide of corporate noise. One night, he typed a message he couldn't bring himself to send. "I don't know when it happened, but I think of you before I think of anything else." He stared at it, jaw tight. Then, with a sharp breath, he pressed delete. Because he was still a father. Because grief still haunted him. Because she deserved freedom, not entanglement with a man still broken. But the truth remained, unsent yet undeniable. His heart was no longer at peace. It happened on a night when rain bruised the city in silver streaks, the kind of storm that made New York's skyscrapers hum like tuning forks. Amara had just collapsed into bed after a 12-hour hospital shift when her phone vibrated violently on the nightstand. The caller ID, Ethan. Her stomach dropped. He never called, only texted, short and neat. She answered with a whisper, her voice still hoarse from the day. "Amara." His tone was ragged. "It's Lily. She's burning up. I don't know what else to do." Amara sat bolt upright. "How high is her fever?" 102, he said quickly. "She's crying. Won't stop. I've tried cool cloths, but—" His voice cracked, panic rising through it like floodwater. "Listen to me," Amara cut in firmly, sliding into jeans and pulling a sweatshirt over her head. Cool compress on her forehead, small sips of water if she can swallow. "I'm coming." By the time she reached his Upper West Side apartment, the rain had plastered her hair to her face, her sneakers squelching with every step. The door swung open before she could knock. Ethan stood there, tie loosened, shirt damp with sweat, eyes hollowed with fear. "She's upstairs," he rasped, stepping aside. Amara rushed up the staircase and into Lily's room. The child lay curled beneath tangled sheets, cheeks flushed, her little body shivering with fever. The sight struck Amara like a physical blow. She dropped to the bedside, pressing a cool hand to Lily's forehead. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered. "It's okay. I'm here." Lily whimpered, eyes half open, reaching weakly toward Amara as though recognizing her voice more than her face. Amara smoothed the damp curls from her temples and laid a fresh cloth across her brow. "Ethan," she said without looking back, "bring water. Just a little at a time." He returned quickly, fumbling the glass into her hands. His fingers brushed hers, ice cold, trembling. For a man who commanded boardrooms with steel composure, tonight he looked undone, as fragile as the child in the bed. She looks like her mother did that night," he stammered. "It started with a fever. By morning, she was gone. And His voice broke. "I can't lose her, too." Amara turned sharply, meeting his haunted eyes. "This isn't the same, Ethan. Lily's strong. You called early. You're not alone this time. Listen to me. She's going to be okay." Still he hovered, fists clenched at his sides, eyes wide with helplessness. So Amara did the only thing she knew that could soothe more than medicine. She began to hum. The melody rose soft and low, a tune her grandmother had carried from West Africa, sung in kitchens when pots simmered and in bedrooms when fear stalked children's dreams. A lullaby not written on paper, but woven through generations. "Sleep, little one. The night is kind. The stars will guard. The moon will find." Her voice filled the room like a warm blanket, weaving between the hiss of rain on the windows and the uneven rhythm of Lily's breaths. The child's trembling softened, her little fingers unclenched, resting against Amara's wrist. The fever had not broken, but the panic eased, her cries replaced by small sighs as her body surrendered to the music. Ethan sank into the chair beside the bed, his shoulders caving as if the sound had broken open the fortress he had built around his grief. "She used to sing," he whispered hoarsely. "Her mother. Not the same words, but the tune. It's the same." Amara kept humming, her own throat tight, eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. She finished the verse, brushed Lily's curls back, and adjusted the blanket around her. The child drifted into a restless but steadier sleep. The silence afterward was heavy. Only the rain kept time. Ethan pressed his hands to his face. For the first time since she'd met him, he sobbed openly. Not the neat, restrained tears of a man trying to stay strong, but the raw, unguarded sobs of someone who had carried too much alone for too long. Amara reached across the bed, laying her hand gently over his. "It's okay to cry, Ethan," she murmured. "Strength isn't silence. Children don't forget love. They just wait to hear it again." His shoulders shook. He let the words in. He let the song linger. And for a few fragile minutes, he let someone else hold part of his grief. They kept vigil through the night. Amara refreshed the cloths, checked Lily's temperature, coaxed her into sipping water. Ethan stayed beside her, listening to the lullaby replay itself in his mind. The storm outside ebbed toward dawn, light creeping pale and new across the skyline. At last, Lily stirred, her forehead cooler, her breathing easier. Her eyes fluttered open just enough to find Amara, then her father. A faint smile tugged at her lips before she drifted back into sleep. Amara exhaled, relief flooding through her. "Her fever's breaking," she whispered. Ethan leaned back, covering his face with both hands, his chest rising in a long, ragged breath. When he looked at Amara again, his eyes were red but clearer than she had ever seen them. "You gave her back a piece of her mother tonight," he said softly. Amara shook her head. "No, she already carried it inside her. I just reminded her how to hear it." For a moment, neither moved. The apartment was hushed, except for the child's steady breathing. Ethan reached for her hand, not with the hunger of a man seeking comfort, but with the gratitude of a man who had found it. "Thank you," he whispered, "for saving both of us." Her pulse thrummed at the contact, but she did not pull away. "I didn't save you, Ethan. I just stayed." Yet she knew the truth. Something had shifted irrevocably. Not just for Lily, but for Ethan and for herself. This night had carried them across a threshold, one they could never retreat from again. The envelope looked ordinary, thin, ivory, resting on the chipped wooden table in Amara's Harlem apartment. Yet it carried the weight of every sleepless night, every shift at the hospital, every hour she had spent buried in textbooks while her friends went dancing or sleeping or simply living. She stared at it for a long time before she touched it. Her hands, usually so steady on an IV line or in the controlled chaos of pediatrics, trembled now. She traced the embossed crest at the top. Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing, Baltimore, Maryland. The radiator rattled behind her, as if reminding her where she was. Home, Harlem, the place that had shaped her resilience. For a moment, she thought about leaving the envelope sealed, because once opened, life would tilt one way or another. Finally, she slid a butter knife beneath the flap. The letter unfolded like the breath she'd been holding since childhood. "We are delighted to offer you admission. Full tuition scholarship. Pediatric nursing track. Research placement available." Her knees buckled. She pressed a hand to the table to steady herself. The words blurred, then cleared, and she read them again, out loud this time, as though hearing them would make them more real. "Full scholarship. Pediatric nursing. Research placement." Her laugh broke out sharp, almost wild. She clutched the letter to her chest and spun once in the cramped kitchen, knocking her hip against the counter. Joy filled her like sunlight in a long, locked room. She grabbed her phone, snapping a photo for Simone with shaky fingers. Within seconds, a reply flashed back. "Ah, you're going to be a nurse who changes the world. Tonight, we celebrate. No excuses." Amara sank into her chair, staring at the letter again. The joy didn't vanish, but it tangled with something else. Fear. Because Baltimore meant leaving. It meant packing her life into boxes, saying goodbye to Harlem nights, to her patients, to Ethan and Lily. Especially to them. The next evening, she went to Ethan's apartment. He opened the door with Lily clinging to his leg, her curls bouncing. "You're early," he said, smiling faintly. "I needed to see you," Amara replied, stepping inside. They sat together at the dining table, Lily humming to herself in the living room as she built a castle from blocks. Amara slid the letter across the wood. Ethan picked it up, scanning quickly. His eyes shifted, widening, then softening. "Johns Hopkins," he said quietly. "Full scholarship." She nodded, unable to keep her hands from twisting in her lap. "It's everything I've worked for, everything my mother dreamed for me. But it means leaving. Baltimore isn't just a train ride away, it's a whole new life." He leaned back, letter still in hand, his gaze steady on her. "Amara, this isn't a choice. This is destiny calling. You've earned it." Her throat tightened. "But what about Lily? About you?" At that, Ethan's expression shifted. For a flicker of a second, she saw the man who had wept in the night when the lullaby reminded him of his late wife, the father who had crumbled when Lily's fever burned hot against her skin. But then he exhaled, and his features settled into something calmer, truer. "Love isn't about holding someone back," he said softly. "It's about letting them become everything they're meant to be. You don't owe me your dreams." "And Lily," his voice faltered, then steadied again. Lily needs to see that the women she looks up to don't shrink to fit inside someone else's life. Amara swallowed hard. So you're telling me to go? I'm telling you I'll be proud every step you take, Ethan answered. And if the road brings you back to New York, then it does. But even if it doesn't, you'll still be part of us. Always. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. She covered her face with her hands, the weight of the choice pressing down. Then she felt his hand, warm and steady, covering hers. No promises tonight, he murmured. No guarantees, just respect. And faith. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Lily's laughter floated from the living room, her small voice narrating the adventure of her toy castle. Amara lowered her hands and looked at Ethan. His eyes held no demand, no plea, only quiet conviction that she was more than enough, that she was worthy of the future waiting for her. She stood, almost without realizing it, and walked into the living room. Lily looked up, beaming. Want to help me build the tower? Amara knelt beside her, slipping a block into place. Her heart ached, but the ache was mixed with hope, with the certainty that this goodbye, if it came, would not be an ending. Later, when she left Ethan's apartment, the city air wrapped around her, cool and sharp. She tucked the letter back into her bag, but the words were burned into her skin. Full scholarship. Pediatric nursing. Johns Hopkins. On the subway ride home, she stared at her reflection in the darkened window. For the first time, she didn't see a girl in her mother's faded dress. She saw a woman with her own light, her own path, her own wings, and she whispered to herself, steady and fierce, I'm ready. The train from Baltimore slid into Penn Station beneath a ceiling painted with shadows and echoes. Amara stepped onto the platform with a steady rhythm in her stride, a rolling suitcase behind her, and a leather satchel pressed close against her hip. The air smelled like iron, old oil, and pretzels, New York in its rawest form. She paused at the top of the escalator, letting the tide of travelers surge around her. A year ago, she had left this city still a student, anxious and fragile, carrying more dreams than resources. Now she returned as a registered nurse, her name stitched proudly onto a white badge, her voice stronger from presenting research at Johns Hopkins, her shoulders squared by battles she had fought in hospital wards and classrooms. Baltimore had shaped her, but Harlem was still her heartbeat. She breathed in the city as though it had been waiting, and for the first time she didn't feel like she was trying to catch up. She felt like she belonged. The next evening, her phone buzzed. Ethan. Rooftop. Tomorrow. 7 p.m. No further explanation. No indulgent flourishes. Just coordinates, like a map leading her to a place she wasn't sure she still had permission to claim. The following night, she stood at the entrance of Blake Organics headquarters, the glass tower rising over Midtown. She passed through security, her reflection flickering in the mirrored walls until she reached the elevator that carried her to the roof. The doors opened to a garden suspended above the city. Strings of lights arched between planters, casting a golden glow against the Manhattan skyline. Guests milled among display tables set with sleek packages of organic snacks, sipping champagne as if this launch were just another corporate gala. But then Amara saw the banners. For the mothers who stayed hungry to feed hope. The words hit her chest like a sudden chord. She thought of her own mother skipping meals so Amara could have seconds, of nights when dignity was measured in the silence of a stomach held tight against hunger. Tears stung her eyes. This was no slogan. It was memory turned into mission. You found the line. The voice came from behind her. Ethan. She turned slowly. He stood in a dark suit, collar open, the city lights casting silver along the edge of his jaw. He looked older and yet freer, the weight in his posture no longer the same relentless armor she remembered. You remembered? She whispered. I didn't remember, he said softly. I lived it, listening to you, watching. You taught me dignity doesn't start in boardrooms. It starts at a kitchen table where a mother pretends she isn't hungry so her child can eat. I wanted to build a product line worthy of that truth. Her throat tightened. I didn't do this. You did, he insisted gently. Every note you scribbled on my drafts, every question you asked about real children, real families. You may not see it, but this, he gestured to the rooftop, to the lights, to the slogan, is yours too. She shook her head, overwhelmed, her heart racing with too many memories. Nights in Harlem with radiators rattling, mornings in Baltimore with textbooks spread across hospital cafeterias, evenings in his apartment while Lily slept in the next room. Why now? She asked finally. Why bring me back into this world? For a moment, Ethan said nothing. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. He opened it, not to reveal diamonds, but a simple silver ring, unadorned, polished only by the promise behind it. Gasps rippled from the nearest guests, but Ethan's eyes never left hers. I don't want to save you, Amara. I don't want to rescue you from hunger or hardship or ambition. You've already saved yourself. What I want... He hesitated, his voice cracking before steadying, is to walk beside you. To be the man who shares the weight, not the man who tries to replace your strength. Amara's breath caught. She had braced herself for grandeur, for a fairy tale gesture that might cheapen what they had built. But this was different. The ring was plain, almost humble, and it mirrored exactly what her heart had longed for. Not salvation, but partnership. I don't need a fairy tale, she whispered. Neither do I, Ethan replied. I just need a life that's real. With you. The city noise roared below, but up here it was as though the night had paused for them alone. Her eyes blurred as she looked down at the ring. For the first time, she wasn't choosing out of desperation or fear. She was choosing from a place of abundance, from the steady ground she had earned with her own 2 hands. She lifted her gaze, tears glimmering. Yes, she said. A cheer broke from the guests. Someone clapped, and then a child's voice split the air, bright, clear, and filled with delight. I knew it! Lily barreled across the rooftop, curls bouncing, a paper crown perched askew on her head. She flung her arms around Amara's waist. Daddy said you'd say yes! Amara laughed through her tears, clutching Lily close. Ethan slid the silver band onto her finger, his hand trembling just enough to betray the depth of the moment. Then his palm rested over hers, steady as a vow without words. In that instant, Amara realized her life had circled back to the city that raised her. But she was no longer the girl smoothing the creases of her mother's faded dress at a table in Manhattan. She was a woman who had survived hunger and humiliation, who had claimed her voice in lecture halls and conference rooms, who now stood on a rooftop with a man and a child offering not rescue, but home. The skyline blazed around them. The rooftop thrummed with applause, and Amara felt the truth settle inside her. Love had not rewritten her story into a fairy tale. It had simply given her the courage to keep writing in her own hand. The restaurant on 125th Street hadn't changed much. The awning still sagged slightly over the doorway, the smell of garlic and simmering tomatoes still spilled onto the street, and the same corner table by the window sat waiting, polished by years of elbows and conversations. But Amara had changed. The last time she'd stepped through these doors, she had been alone, wearing her mother's faded dress, waiting for a blind date who never came. She remembered staring at her glass of water, cheeks burning with humiliation, wondering if she should slip away before anyone noticed her shame. That night, Ethan's quiet act, sending a plate of pasta and a glass of lemonade, had shifted her world. It hadn't erased the loneliness or the hunger, but it had reminded her that she was still worthy of dignity. Now she walked back into the same restaurant with Ethan at her side and Lily skipping between them, a paper crown tilting on the child's curls. 3 tonight, Lily announced proudly to the hostess, her small hand gripping Amara's. The hostess smiled. "Would you like the table by the window?" "Yes," Amara said, her voice steady. The 3 of them slid into the booth. Lily pressed her palms to the glass, marveling at the glow of the Harlem streetlights. Ethan loosened his tie, his body relaxing as though this place, so ordinary, allowed him to set down the weight of CEO titles and endless responsibilities. Amara folded her hands, letting herself breathe in the moment. For the first time, she felt that the table did not remind her of loss. It reminded her of how far she had come, from a student clutching borrowed dignity to a nurse standing tall in her own right, from loneliness to love. The waiter approached. Ethan glanced at Amara and then at Lily. "Spaghetti for the table," he said with a half smile. Amara laughed softly. "Some traditions are worth keeping." "And lemonade," Lily added, bouncing in her seat. "Because Daddy said lemonade is what makes it magic." When the glasses arrived, condensation sliding down their sides, Amara lifted hers. The tart sweetness burst on her tongue, and she nearly laughed. Once, this lemonade had tasted like rescue. Tonight, it tasted like home. While they waited for their food, Lily pulled crayons from her little bag and began sketching on the paper placemat. Her brow furrowed with concentration, and then her face lit as she turned the drawing toward them. "It's us," she declared. The picture showed 3 stick figures, smiling, hand in hand around a plate of spaghetti. Above them, in crooked letters, she had written, U.S. Ethan cleared his throat. His hand brushed against Amara's, lingering. Amara smoothed a curl from Lily's forehead. "It's perfect, sweetheart." Dinner arrived. Steaming bowls of pasta, garlic bread still warm from the oven. Ethan served Lily first, careful with the portion, then filled Amara's plate before his own. It was such a small gesture, but one that spoke louder than grand declarations. They ate slowly, laughter weaving through their words. Lily smeared sauce on her cheek and giggled when Amara wiped it gently. Ethan watched them with a look that made Amara's heart ache. Part gratitude, part awe, part quiet relief, as though he still couldn't believe this simple table had become their altar of belonging. Halfway through the meal, Lily asked, "Are we really a family now?" The question stilled them. Around them, couples clinked glasses, forks scraped plates, waiters hurried past, but at their table, time paused. Amara leaned close, her voice tender. "Yes, sweetheart. We're a family, not because of papers or promises, but because we choose each other every day." Ethan reached across the table, his fingers closing over Amara's. His voice was steady, low. "She's right. Family isn't something you inherit. It's something you build. Sometimes from hunger, sometimes from heartbreak. But if you keep choosing it, it becomes stronger than blood." Amara nodded, tears catching the edges of her smile. "Then let's keep choosing." For a while, they ate in silence, bound not by grand vows, but by trust. When the plates were cleared, the waiter brought 3 small bowls of lemon sorbet on the house. Lily clapped, delighted, insisting they clink spoons before digging in. The sorbet melted tart and cold on Amara's tongue, bright against the warmth of the pasta, and she thought, this is what life should taste like, sweet, sharp, fleeting, but real. After dinner, they stepped outside into the cool Harlem night. The sidewalks pulsed with music from a street saxophone. with children chasing each other, with the steady rhythm of the city that had always demanded resilience. Amara paused and looked back at the restaurant's window, the same one where she had once sat alone. "You were never late," she whispered to Ethan, her voice carrying the weight of a year's worth of growth. "I just had to wait long enough to believe." He slipped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "And I'll keep showing up, as long as it takes." Lily reached for both their hands, tugging them forward. The three of them walked down 125th Street together, their steps falling into rhythm, their shadows stretching long beneath the street lamps. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't a rescue. It was something harder, something truer, a family born from courage, kindness, and the stubborn faith that love in its simplest form could heal. And at a table in Harlem, with spaghetti, lemonade, and a child's drawing, their story had found its home. Thank you for staying with us until the end of Amara, Ethan, and little Lily's journey. Their story reminds us that love is not about rescue. It's about kindness, courage, and choosing each other every single day. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us share more stories of hope and healing.